Welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week, we are talking about finding your ground and taking up your space. What's the difference? What stops us from doing this? How can we learn to practice? And how does this support us as leaders? So join us in Being Your Ground, Filling Your Space.
Gentlemen, if you are going to be out and about on the 29th of January, you might need to carry some cash with you or even pairs of gloves, because it used to be the law in Scotland, so maybe it's only Scottish fellas that need to be worried about this. Queen Margaret made it a law that if a man turned down a proposal from a lady on the 29th of February, he had to pay a fine of £1 or give enough fine silk for a gown.
I heard that story as well. Even before that, I found where this may well have come from as long ago as the 5th century. And when I tell you this story, it put me in mind of the countless stories you have told me of when you have said why and haven't accepted the status quo. And I know that some of those have come out on other episodes of ours. So for those of you listening, you might want to go back and have a listen to some of other Bridget's stories of when she said why. So this one is an ancient Irish folk tale, and it is about two saints, one of which is called Saint Bridget of Kildare. Saint Bridget of Kildare. Can you believe it? And the other one is St. Patrick.
Bobby, she's the patroness saint of Ireland. Bridget has her own bank holiday in Ireland.
That's me being taught something then. So anyway, Saint Bridget, seemingly, and this may well have been why she's become the patron saint, she was the one that told St. Patrick that women should be allowed to propose. So St. Patrick made a decree that this could go ahead, but only on Leap Day. And that was then immediately followed up, or folklore says, by Saint Bridget proposing to St. Patrick, and he turned her down.
Well, I hope that he bought her 12 pairs of gloves, because that's the payment in Denmark. And in Finland, you have to provide enough fabric for a skirt if you turn the brave lady down.
Because seemingly the story goes that he gave her a silk dress instead.
So why, Bobby, are we talking about ladies proposing to gentlemen?
I don't know. You came up with this ridiculous idea.
Okay, well, I'll explain it.
My version of it, and then we'll see, as per usual, whether we're going to correlate or not. So we've called this one about being your ground and filling your space, because the whole thing about women proposing on a leap year day, or in fact taking up their own space, taking up their ground, I think that's where we started with on the topic, or it would segue into it. And then moving that further into leaders. So it's not just about women. So it becomes more about both sexes, about how you can be more grounded in your purpose and what you want to bring and what you want to bring forth, but also taking up your space and what it's like when you're actually shrinking in a group or not taking up your own space. So I'm hoping that that's where we're going with this. Otherwise, my notes are about as much use as a chocolate teapot.
Oh, I think there's a use for a chocolate teapot. You can eat it. So, I had been looking at this for a couple of reasons. One, because I saw this great poem on a platform called Button Poetry. And I watch it every now and then, and it features poets, but mainly activism poetry. And this one was by a woman called Lily Myers, and it's called Shrinking Women. And she talks about watching her mother shrink and eat less food as she gets older, but also at the same time watching her father grow and take up more space. And she talks about why it is that women have a tendency or are sort of generally taught by society that they should be taking up less space, evidenced by things like on the tube, men have their legs wide spread and women are usually have their arms folded, their elbows in and their legs crossed. And we're taught, that good ladies cross their legs. And we don't see, maybe we do more now, but I'm really interested in sort of why I can't, or why it's viewed as indelicate for women to sit more spread out like men do. And I started doing it, and it's actually a really much more comfortable way to sit. So that was what made me start to look at this idea of particularly women shrinking and taking up less space. And then I guess thinking about, what does taking up space mean? What does that mean? And for a lot of people, and I guess the first thing we think about is visibility. But then we can talk about, as you have, it's about being able to speak, to say what you think or you feel, to express yourself, not to self-censor because you perceive, or there is a societal pressure for you not to be or to express yourself in a particular way. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm coming from. And I have come at it from a much more impact on female point of view. But of course, you're absolutely right. When we talk about, or when I talk about particularly women, impacts on women, I'm generally talking about impacts on underrepresented people. And that can be men in many scenarios, and taking up space for people who are neurodivergent. And it's about what society expects and sort of pushing back against that.
Absolutely. And I similarly have come at it from that angle. And I guess I've had a look at a couple of studies, which gets a little bit into science, which always scares me a bit because it's not my massive forte, but I'm going to give it a go. But interestingly, one of the first studies that I found started with the way that you were talking about the man spreading. You find gents in meetings, sometimes with their arms behind their head, leaning back, basically just taking up a lot more space. Well, I've watched it in meetings, and I've done it to myself as well, where I am slightly more hunched or hunched over and really not taking up very much space at all. And like you're saying, when you look at it from marginalized people or people shaping what's happened to them in history, I think that there's a whole host of things where there is that shrinkage going on, or the lack of eye contact, which actually is part and parcel of taking up your space. But what that's like for people who don't want to be making eye contact. So anyway, these studies that I looked at actually said that one of them was around a dating app. Don't worry, Ash, I have not been on a dating app just before we start spreading any ghastly rumours via the podcast. The app was sort of like talking about photographs, and be that male or female, but those that had their arms out, legs apart, not in any rude connotation way, that they're looking directly into the camera, much more open, that be it males or females, they were getting more hits on them than people that didn't. So, if we go back to the leap year thing, I don't think that any woman out there who's planning on giving that a go should be down on one knee, because that is a real level of shrinkage like you never believe. And then, on this topic, I would strongly encourage anyone listening to this podcast to watch Amy Cuddy's TED Talk if they haven't already. And it is called Your Body Language May Shape Who You Are. And she talks about faking it till you make it, but in actual fact, faking it until you become it. And she talks all about, and I know we both have some concern about using the word power, but she talks about power poses and what those do to levels of testosterone and cortisol. Because if you stand like Wonder Woman, and a lot of people who know me, who may well be listening to this, I often say to them, go into the toilet and stand like Wonder Woman for 2 minutes before you go into that interview, before you go and propose something in a meeting. But it actually does settle cortisol and increase testosterone, be that a man or a woman.
So it's the Wonder Woman pose with your legs astride. Correct. And your hands on your hips.
And in this TED Talk, she talks a lot about the research that she has done. So again, she shows those poses. So those things about leaning back with your hands behind your head, the legs wide. I love the Wonder Woman pose because I think not everybody wants to be doing this visibly in a meeting, but you can that or man spreading or person spreading or whatever it might be. But this whole thing with this Wonder Woman pose that you can go and quietly do by yourself in a toilet will have the same effect of increasing that level of testosterone just with the breathing. That's what she encourages everybody come the end of the talk. But there's a lot of great science in there about what sensations it brings to you if you have those shrinking poses, the hunched up shoulders, the crossing the arms, the making yourself much smaller versus that wider stance and opening yourself up. So that's why I say, I think from a leadership perspective, being involved in that. And she also talks about facial changes as well. And I can't remember exactly what she says, but she says something about putting a pen or a pencil between your teeth. It forces you to smile. And
it's also a really good face yoga pose. I sometimes, when I remember, do face yoga, and it's having that between your teeth is supposed to be, I can't remember which bit of you, it's supposed to, I think it's supposed to help your jawline. So
exactly.
Two benefits.
I'll get rid of 5 chins and I might be a better leader as well. But what it does to your emotion and the way that you're feeling makes for a different body makeup, which enables you to take up more space.
Well, I'd always been told that smiling or just laughing, even when you don't feel like it, kind of generates the same, hormonal reaction than it would if you genuinely were smiling or laughing. So I do try if I'm not feeling it or feeling annoyed about something, that just trying to smile or to laugh when you definitely are not feeling in that way does change it also changes your mindset a little bit, because sometimes I then just have to laugh at myself for being such a fucking weirdo that when I'm laughing at something that doesn't exist. But talking about your poses, I'm fascinated by the somatics work that you do. And I was thinking years ago when I used to do a lot of yoga, I used to love the warrior poses, and the warrior poses used to make me feel amazing, like really strong and powerful. So maybe that's why I became such a why person and challenging things, because I spent too much time in the warrior pose. But a pose that I came across recently, which you definitely, I probably wouldn't advise to be doing in a meeting room in front of people, is the goddess pose. And I hadn't come across that one, but I did at a somatic workshop that I did recently. And actually that also was a really, really grounding and quite calming, but also sort of it felt sort of, how do I describe this? There was a real gentle power in it. It didn't feel, not quite the same as the warrior pose, but it did feel powerful, but maybe because it felt so grounded. Anyway, I love the goddess pose. And it's also you don't have to be particularly bendy or, sort of an Instagram yoga princess to be able to do it. So, and I say that's a really nasty thing to say, bitch. I'm obviously triggered by Guinea yoga people, but I think it's an easy pose to do, and it's really powerful. I'll stop talking now before I say anything more rude about skinny yoga people.
I have some very good yoga friends. I'm sure you do as well, but we love you too. Honestly, we ought to put the link on for that, because I don't know the goddess pose. So are you able to even describe it without upsetting any yogis out there?
It's sort of it's a wide squat, and I wouldn't say squat, but it's sort of a wide-legged bent knee stance, then with your arms out. So it is, you effectively just you take up as much space as you possibly can. So maybe that's why it feels so powerful, because, and particularly for those women who do tend to try and take up less space, it's actually giving permission to just be as big as you can and take up as much space as you can. And I quite like that sort of idea of just pushing back, even if you don't, even as you say, you do it in the privacy of your own home. It's practicing just feeling, because effectively taking up space, particularly physical space, but also in other ways, it's saying, I deserve to be here, which often people struggle with mentally, when we talked about that interpretation of imposter syndrome, where people just are like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here. But actually taking up space is the counter to that, is to say, no, I do deserve to be here. I have a right. It's non-negotiable. And as you say, faking it till you are.
For sure.
It takes practice.
And I think the thing that I like with what you're saying about the the goddess pose, and I'm going to riff off it a bit with a somatic practice, is that this is where I find the distinction, but the sameness around taking up your full space and finding your ground. So that pose that you're talking about needs to be rooted in really good finding your feet. You know, that solidity that you've got from the feet all the way through the body. And in my somatic work, we do work which is like a whole body scan, where you start from the feet, you move up through the legs, into the stomach, all the way up through to the top of your head. So that length piece is about dignity. You've got some level of that with what you're saying with the goddess pose. I love the word dignity because I think that comes in to taking up your space. And then you said about the wide arms. So we also go for width. So, you know, that's about taking up your space, but having other people in it. And then the other one we go for is depth as well. You know, your experience. And I think that takes us back to the Amy Cuddy of faking it until you become it, because you've got to start believing in this new narrative, this new way of being, rather than the shrinking person that you may well have been in the past. So you have to keep practicing it until you become something else. But I love that idea of the grounding and what yoga brings to that, because it does all of those things as well as that tightening of the stomach, which gives you a good core. All of those things I think are also important. So it's another great practice, be it yoga or somatic practices, about being resilient, being strong and powerful, or whatever word we want to use, from your legs through to your head and to both sides of you, as well as taking up your full space.
And then there's another element to this idea of taking up space rather than just physical space, whether it's manspreading, goddess posing, or Wonder Womaning. Mm-hmm. And that's your voice, or speaking out when you have something to say. And it, again, when I was thinking about this while, getting ready for our chat, I actually remembered, weirdly, I haven't thought about this for years, when I was a lot younger, so probably in my teens, so, centuries ago, literally, I was always the outspoken one. I was always the one whose voice was heard. And while I was at an all-girls school, so I didn't have that sort of the societal pressure from, maybe other boys being in the class and wanting to impress them. As I was out in, the world, I became very aware that it wasn't quite as well received that this sort of loud young woman was out expressing her opinions. And there were a number of other girls, one in particular, who was always seemed to be quite attractive to the boys. And she had this little tinkly laugh. And it was very feminine little sort of laugh. And not the big bellowing belly laugh that we both have. Yep. Or the dirty laugh.
Guttural witch life. Hackle.
I sort of concluded I didn't have a very feminine laugh. And so I tried to change it. And so I started laughing in this sort of tinkly manner, which was completely authentic for her, but completely inauthentic for me. And I think I must have spent a year trying to laugh like that and, really training myself to... I look back on it now, and obviously that I gave it up. I don't know what stage I gave it up, whether it just became too hard. But I just was thinking, wow, I really, at that point, there was something must have made me feel the need to be what I perceived at the time more feminine, or that I wasn't as feminine or attractive as I could be. And so that's made me think about voices and speaking out, and why one of the big issues that women express in businesses or in organizations is that they're interrupted. I think there's quite a lot of research that show that women are interrupted more than men in meetings generally. Obviously, not every woman is the same. And I wondered about things, how you can sort of overcome those things. I've got a couple of things that I used to advise people to do. The main one would be that you wait until the interruption's finished and then you smile and just go, I hadn't finished. And that works sometimes. it works if you have other people in the room who might be supportive of you. And I know other men who would turn around and say, oh, sorry, so-and-so, I don't think you'd finished. So there's an element of mentoring, support and sponsorship behaviours that go on, allyship behaviours that could go on in the room. But I wondered, is that something that you'd come across? I'm a bit scared to imagine the type of guy who would dare to interrupt you, Bobby. But anyway, I'm sure you have examples of it or other ways that you can make sure your voice is heard.
Oh my God, where do I start? Well, there's like the bad ones where I know that my inner voice has leaked out onto my face, like rolling my eyes or sighing loudly. Yes, so they're not the quite such constructive ones. I think I'd also say, look, the tinkly laughing, there's a place for it. It's not something that I've ever done myself. I think I've always been a bit of a squawker and now belly laugher. If I think back to voice in the first instance, and again, this is something that needs practice, but where you breathe from or where you speak from, because if you catch your breath or you hold it and it goes very fast and it's a little bit higher and everything else besides, I mean, you can hear that because I was breathing just in a tiny bit of the uppermost of my chest and feeling really, really taut. If you are making sure that you are taking deep breaths all the way into your belly and pausing, it's another way of taking up space. That's the first thing I would say. The other thing I want to say before the allyship piece, I think, is that there is also a level of there's a bit of language that we need to stop doing, which supports taking up space. One of which is stopping to say sorry. I'm sorry, but I haven't finished. Why the fuck am I apologizing? You've just interrupted me. Or the other word is just. I've just got one more thing to say. Like you're decreasing the impact of it with the word just, or it's just an old thing I threw on, or whatever it might be. So sorry and just, I think, are two things that I make every attempt to get rid of. And that breathing, the other thing that I might do is I might put my hands out on the desk, on the table, so that you are already taking up more space. You don't necessarily need to lean forward, but just some level of movement to bring more capacity, more openness. And then there are those, the hand signal of, I'm going to finish what I had other things to say before we move on. I want to loop back round because I haven't finished my point. But the hand gestures to make yourself bigger is something else I would probably do as well. But the not necessarily making yourself sound like a man, but I do find that with a deeper voice, you gain more attention because yes.
Well, I think it was Margaret Thatcher, wasn't it, who famously had elocution lessons to lower her pitch so that she was taken more seriously because she perceived that she would not be. She read the sort of societal norms well enough to know that she wasn't going to succeed unless she fitted in.
Absolutely.
To the male.
I think that the pausing comes with risk because if other people aren't checking their breathing or really actively listening, they think that the pause is for them to jump in and say something really important. I have been known, again, this is probably not the most constructive thing, but to sort of make a slight joke of things by saying, I was pausing for dramatic effect, not for you to hop into it. Which I don't know quite how well that goes down sometimes, but it's just, there's the word just, bringing people up with a bit of a start, but showing in your body that there is a no, you can't do that to me. And as I say, it doesn't need to be aggressive. It doesn't need to be overly assertive, but whatever you need to do to show that you are there, which is anything other than sitting with your arms folded, hunkered over your notebook, with your head down, not making eye contact.
Yeah, and I think that we just need to emphasize, though, don't we, Bobby, that a lot of this takes practice if it's not something that comes naturally. One suggestion that I would have would be start practicing taking up space amongst your friends so that, one, you can get feedback also. And obviously friends who are nice, maybe not ones who are going to constantly take the piss out of you. So you do need to
choose
think
carefully
about some of the groups of my friends who would just constantly be teasing me. But I think that practicing amongst friends and then moving on to sort of public, decisions in public to take up more space. And I think one of the things you'd mentioned before was meeting people's gazes. And I think that often for many people is actually a big step. So meeting people's gazes and then practicing to, then actually physically taking up more space. So whether that is maybe wearing trousers on the tube and spreading your legs, oh God, that sounds so wrong. But, sitting with your legs further apart than you might normally do, putting your arms on armrests, all of those sort of things to just practice what it feels like to take up more physical space than you're used to. And it actually makes me think about teenage, because I see teenagers, and it's not just women, but particularly tall teenagers actually. And actually, it does go on into adulthood for some people. Many tall people try and make themselves smaller. I've never experienced that because I'm a hobbit. But, tall people often are slumped because they are self-conscious about the amount of space that they take up. And it always makes me sad when I see young women and young men there with their shoulders hunched and looking down on the ground. And I guess that's, a lot of the puberty issues going on and all the hormones raging and all of the fitting in pressures, et cetera, which I just do think are much more nowadays than when we were teenagers. I'm glad that I'm not a teenager now, I have to say, having to put up with all of the pressure on social media about appearance and how you look. But that's maybe
another day.
Podcast for another day. But I do notice that sort of hunching over of tall people who are also afraid to take up space.
And I worked with somebody once where they were incredibly tall, and whilst doing the somatic practices, felt like they got really long limbs and everything. And of course, they were then saying, "Oh God, I feel really out of control because my limbs are so long." And I said, "Well, there's nothing you can do about your length, but in terms of putting your arms out wide, just bring them in a bit, bring them in somewhere that's comfortable." And so there's a level of, if people are taller, bigger, you may well feel the need to right size. But the smaller, I honestly, that whole element about straight, and I'm bound, am I bound to say this because I've been in the military? But that dignified way of straight back, shoulders back, looking up and out is dignity. I am here. I'm sure my husband and my brother, well, it's too late because I'm about to say this if they mind, they're 5'7". They're 5'7", and I think the two of them have got inordinate presence when they walk into a room. People know they're there.
Yeah.
They're not slouching, and they don't even really need to be saying anything, but they walk in with that level of whatever they've got in their body to go, I'm in the room. And to be fair, my love, I think we do too. And I'm no less hobbit-like than you are. And I know that I think maybe people know that we're there because we're making a huge frigging noise a lot of the time, but also in terms of how we carry ourselves. And Ella used to get, my daughter used to go mad when we were traveling in London together because I would make eye contact with people on the underground. And she's like, it's just not the done thing. And people would start talking to me. It was so mad. But I make eye contact. People talk to me all the time. I smile. I'm taking up my space. And there are other days where I might not want. And so I put my eyes down to the ground. But more often than not, I am looking up and out. And I think that body shape allows for a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to this idea of your inner voice expressing it, leaking out onto your face, I think was how you described it. And just to talk about anger just for a short while, because it's interesting how anger is perceived, particularly between the sexes, and even more so when then you add a racial lens to it. And so anger, and I was listening to a friend of mine on a podcast yesterday talking about why, anger is okay. You're allowed to be angry. And obviously it's how you express it, or et cetera, et cetera. But I found that there was a study in 2008 that found that when men manifested anger, it boosted their perceived status amongst other people. They thought other people would think that they were of an elevated status, i.e., senior management, etc., or were appropriate for senior management. But when women expressed anger, it lowered the perception of their leadership capability. So women who expressed anger generally have lower wages and were viewed as less competent. And I found that really, well, I don't think I was surprised by it, because there is this perception of, the angry woman, and then even more so, the angry Black woman is this stereotype that is viewed by society as just sort of laughable, or, oh, she's lost control, oh, she can't help herself. But anger in men is not perceived in that way generally. And so I just wanted to have a chat about that, because I think that this perception that women shouldn't manifest anger, or shouldn't be angry, or shouldn't show anger is unhelpful and two-faced in a way, because men are allowed to be angry, but women aren't.
I'm wondering if that brings me back. And again, I do not want to profess to be any form of expert in the science, but I wonder if there is some element in that, again, with these levels of testosterone and cortisol, and where the anger comes from. Because I do wonder, and again, this is a mass generalization, so I need to be careful with this, but whether anger, particularly in females, comes from stress. So, or fear, because anger is often dressed up as something else. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but it is a case of, why is the perception so much different?
Well, I mean, for me, it's got to be that the stereotype of women in society, up until very recently in our history, were supposed to be the mothers, the ones who, nurturing. And so it's viewed as not typically female to be angry, and people are challenged by that. So I would turn it on its head, your sort of assessment of it in that way, saying that actually it's the reaction to female anger is fear, rather than it coming from fear. Because actually, when I get angry, it's not because I'm afraid; it's because I'm fucking pissed off.
No, that would make sense. I don't know the answer really. I do know about how it can be perceived. Oh, is she on the blob? Is it rag week? All of that bollocks that we've had to put up with. I remember saying to somebody once, I can make this last all fucking month. So please don't think that there's a special week. But
it's just you, because you're an arsehole.
I haven't made you a favourite of any description. I think I've learned the hard way that there's got to be a place for anger to be allowed to be conveyed. But I wonder if there's a different way of doing it, because for any of us, I mean, if a man is really angry, I just think if you lose control with anger, be you male or female, you're not grounded anymore. Potentially, you are overinflated rather than taking up your space. There's a level of a lack of control to it. So there's one of the things one of the things that I read somewhere was that the whole thing about taking up your full space, finding your ground, is giving yourself permission to make room for authentic emotions and feelings and boundaries. And so even with anger or whatever emotion it is, or whatever feeling sensation it is, boundary it so it doesn't feel out of control, so that you can stay connected to others. And I'd say that would be the same, be you a male or a female.
I agree. I think generally out of control anger by either a male or a female should be viewed as unprofessional and unacceptable.
We need to take a breath and
I guess
what's actually going on here. And that I think that in my experience, it is often more likely to be a female that calms things the hell down, but isn't likely to say that is not acceptable. That's what I want to hear more of.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of times where I would be accused of being aggressive in meetings when I was simply
expressing yourself. Yeah.
Firmly saying that something wasn't acceptable or that I didn't agree, and wouldn't allow the person, who was generally male, because I was normally the only female in the room, to dismiss or to effectively wipe over the point that I had made. So yes, I don't know that I ever have got out of control angry, but I have been controlled angry and controlled, I guess, vehemently firm about things, which I guess if a man is not used to women expressing themselves confidently and competently, might be perceived as
here's the other thing, and I think I may well have said this before, but often if you are being perceived or judged in a particular way, because I equally have been judged, I'm not going to use the word perceived, judged as aggressive, it is often the person deciding, or they may not even be doing it intentionally, but conveying something that they don't want to show of themselves onto another person. So, to call us aggressive, that's because they don't perceive themselves as aggressive or whatever it might be. So they landed at somebody else's door rather than taking any responsibility for why there has been that reaction to something that they've said or done. I personally think that being judged as a female as aggressive is dismissive. They're basically saying that there's no founding.
Well, there's an element of gaslighting to it as well, in terms of there isn't really any reason for you to be taking this view, and you're just being irrational or hysterical or any of the other words that are used to dismiss women's opinions or thoughts. I found an article because, let me go back, thinking about this idea of taking up more space, and particularly where I've come from it as supporting women to take up more space, I wondered about why women sometimes struggle to do that, other than, some of the things that we've talked about, self-confidence, etc. I'm not really a fan of the single approach of change the woman, not the system, because I am definitely a change the system, not the woman. But it doesn't mean that women don't have internal work to overcome internalized misogyny, bias, self-confidence issues, and lack of self-belief, all of those things that all of us as human beings, men and women, need to work on. But there was a study by the Stanford Gender Research Institute, and it was based on this assumption in organizations, and to get leadership positions, there's this belief that we need to be visible. You need to make yourself more visible to get promotion. You need to be heard, so lower your voice a little bit, do this, in order to get promotion. And that's the reason you're not getting promoted, is because you're not visible enough. And so there's this pressure on women to change, to be more visible. And they looked at some of the reasons why women might choose intentional invisibility. And one that's not surprising is this avoiding backlash, because there are often these pushbacks when women are we both experienced it. And one of the examples in the article was that a woman had left a meeting and this guy came past her and said, "God, I'm glad I'm not married to you." Yep. Because she'd been expressing herself. I think she felt reciprocally the same way. This idea that strong women are bitches. And so women tend to moderate or self-censor or make themselves smaller so that they don't get that backlash. But one of the other reasons, which wasn't quite so obvious, was that women were rejecting this, what I would view as patriarchal view of leadership, that you have to be the visible one, taking, the peacock effectively, because it wasn't authentic for them. And they were saying, I don't do it because it's not who I am. And it's not my style of leadership, because my style of leadership is to be invisible, except as a resource. And so unless organizations start to value that style of leadership and to be aware of it, because a lot of research shows women's contributions are often downplayed, recognizing that leadership, team-based leadership, rather than this sort of idea of the captain of the ship, and that both can be beneficial to the company, really needs to change in terms of leadership culture, to be able to recognize that not all women and not all men lead in that way, and they are just as valuable. But just making a decision about a leadership post on, well, they're not very visible, is really unhelpful for the organization and is basically wiping out 50%, I'd say, of really, really good potential leaders.
I guess in the first instance, I can only speak from my own experience. And there may well be people listening to this podcast who know me very well when I say I never wanted to be a CEO, who are probably then going to throw their head back and laugh, going, why the hell would anyone have ever made you a CEO? And whether that is the case or not, one of the reasons that I have never put my head above the parapet or put myself forward in that way is that I didn't want to be. And this isn't about me not wanting to try. I just didn't want to be. I feel that I was much better team leadership, the way that you've just described it. And I do think that there is a place for that because I decided that my visibility, and maybe this is because of the role I had, was very much more about being visible around the staff, around the teams, being known for that and around my own team, and not really wanting to do any of the peacocking with the board or anything like that. And it was probably to my detriment because I just couldn't be asked with them. It isn't about being invisible or visible. I just thought I don't want to even have to try.
Are we being petulant again, Bobby?
Because there was, I mean, I don't know what you call a group of fucking peacocks, but when there's a lot of them together,
we'll put it in the resources.
I don't want to play. Equally, I know I can be a show-off. I can be a drama queen. I can be all of those things when I'm, in performing clown jester type mode. But from a visibility perspective, it didn't feel real. Absolutely hear that in that research, that doing those sort of things, whereas being visible in groups, but groups that weren't senior or whatever, I felt much more comfortable with and much more in my lane. And that I was capable of offering more to them.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think there is absolutely a place for that form of leadership, both from a male and a female perspective. I don't think that peacocking is the way ahead. I think it makes you isolated. It makes you disconnected. And it's not for me. And I think that the more that we can actually bring those different styles, which still is about taking up space, but in a different way. And I think that means that there's a new definition of visibility that needs to come out of that as well. Not visibility for the sake of it.
I like that. I really like that. Yeah, I really like that, Bobby. I think that it's reformulating it in terms of, and I think the important word there is authenticity. So when we're talking about authenticity and taking up space, we're talking about taking up the space that you want to take up and ensuring that you are able to say the things you need to say. And I love the word dignity. I love this concept of dignity. I think it's really important, just as for human survival. Dignity is fundamental as much as, and I don't mean it to sound in this way, not as much as food and water and shelter, but dignity, but food, water and shelter without dignity is not a real sort of being. And so it's one of the issues politically that I have in terms of foreign aid and humanitarian support, et cetera, is that dignity has to be at the heart of that. Otherwise, the person dies in a way, maybe not physically dying, but mentally. I think that reframing it, that taking up space is taking up the space that you do with dignity and authenticity to say the things and express the things that you wish to express. Have you got a quote?
I have. It's sort of made sense and will bring us full circle, I hope, to looking to offer up some good luck to those out there who are planning on proposing on Leap Day. Our bodies can change our minds, and our minds change our behaviours, and our behaviour changes our outcomes. So Lovely. Good luck, ladies. And men, get yourself to John Lewis or whatever and buy up the glove department.
I think I'd rather have the fabric for a skirt or a fine silk gown.
I'd run on a.
Good luck, everyone.
And on that note, bye.
Thanks, Bobby. Bye. Thanks for listening. That's the last on our theme of love, for the moment. But as we're more than halfway through season 2, we'd love to hear your ideas for topics or themes for season 3. We'll even dedicate an episode to anyone who recommends a topic we run with. Next week, on March the 8th, it's International Women's Day. So we'll be talking about what holds women back and some confusing terminology in being able to break from a sticky floor. See you then.